Hello, this is Eddie McGriff, Regional Extension Agent for the Alabama Cooperative Extension Service. I'm based in North Alabama, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on high-yield corn production. Before I start, I'd like to give a few thank yous. Anytime you see a turtle on a fence post, you know he didn't get there by himself, and that is true with me also. So I'm going to thank all the specialists, researchers, farmers, and industry people that I've worked with over the years that have helped expand my knowledge of corn production. I'd like to especially thank three people. One of them is Randy Dowdy, who in 2004 set the world corn record and is the only farmer to average over or have yields of over 500 bushels in 2 separate years. Randy and I work closely together, and I appreciate his help in expanding my knowledge of corn production. But getting to the farmers in North Alabama that I'd like to thank. First is Henderson Farms, who I did a lot of on-farm research with, and also Nick McMeekin in Center. These two farmers have helped me tremendously by allowing me to put research trials on their farms and also being willing to follow some high-yield corn practices. I will say that Henderson Farms in 2016 have won both the irrigated and the dryland corn contest. They're 305 bushel yield on the irrigated, and Nick McMeekin has won the conservation tillage state contest this year at 285 bushels. One thing I tell farmers first is you have to make a commitment to making higher yields. You got to believe that you can. This is one thing I heard David Hula say, and he has the current corn record, is the first step to making high corn yields is believing that you can and making that commitment to doing those production practices that will lead to higher corn yields. We got a lot of pre-plant decisions we need to think about. The first is soil testing. Do I want a grid sample? I want to go ahead and take my soil samples now. That gives me time to correct my pH. The other thing I also tell farmers to do is to at least have one sample for organic matter so you know what your organic matter is. Organic matter is important. I've seen a wide range from 1.5% to almost 4% organic matter. Every percent organic matter adds 20 pounds of nitrogen and 5 pounds of sulfur per year. So this gives you an idea of how much you're getting from the soil each year. Also, some other things we need to think about in the wintertime is check our irrigation efficiency. I have farmers that say, well, I know that my total outlet is 0.6 inches. Well, that could be that some towers are running 0.4 inches and others are running 0.8 inches. So you want to make sure that you have an even distribution of water with your irrigation system. Now, one thing I will say about this presentation, that it's not, the principles are not only for irrigated growers, but a lot of these principles will be for dryland producers also. The other thing you need to do is to get your planters in proper working order. One of the most important things is planting corn, and sometimes we have some planters on a planter that are not working quite right, and this adds to uneven emergence, and this will add to lower yields. Other things we need to think about when we're thinking about our irrigation system. This is a slide of an irrigation system that was drop nozzles and high pressure, and we had a tall growing variety there, and that simply shredded the leaves. So sometimes farmers will ask me, they said, well, what are all these shredded leaves and it's at a certain height? When you shred these leaves, you decrease the efficiency of your corn leaf, which decreases photosynthesis, which is putting energy into the plant, into the ear. So this hurts your yield. So this may be one thing that you need to look at and consider when you have an irrigation system. Another production practice we need to be thinking about now is our corn variety. And one thing, we have time to order the same size, whether it be small, medium, or large, in the same shape, flats or rounds. And this, if you have the same size and the same shape, this will give you the seed corn more even time to imbibe water and to give you an even emergence. This is very important. Now, farmers ask me, well, what do you recommend? What's best? Flats or rounds, small, medium, or large? And I'll tell them, whichever one your planter plants the best, that's the one you need to be using. Now, another thing we need to think about is corn variety selection. Now, there's a lot of desirable traits, standability, and this is especially important for higher populations, which you're most likely to do if you're shooting for high yield corn. The disease tolerant package, the relative maturity. If you're planting dryland corn, you want to know if that variety has drought tolerance. The transgenic resistance to herbicides and insects are important, but for most farmers, the number one trait is yield potential. And when we think about yield potential, we're going to think about on our farm which varieties have performed the best under our cultural management practices, but also we need to be looking at the Alabama research stations and what their comparison between varieties are. And this is the website that you would go to get the 2016 Alabama corn reports. But another site that I would look at is the National Corn Growers Association contest, the state winners. I'd look at these state winners and I see what varieties they were planting, and this will give you the genetic potential of those varieties, or not the complete genetic potential, but the potential that we've got to make high yields. Now, when we start talking about planting decisions, the next thing we want to think about is what is our seeding population. One thing is to look at your previous year. If you've got 3/4 of an inch tip dieback, that's a good start for determining perfect planting populations. If you're filling that ear all the way out to the tip, you may want to think about next year increasing your population 2,000 to 3,000. I wouldn't do anything dramatic. I would just do it in increments, because one thing we don't want to do is to get our population so high that we have to worry about lodging. The other question farmers ask me is, what do I think is the ideal planting depth? And that would be 2 inches. One thing I will tell you right now, it is not a race when you're planting. If you want a 300 bushel yield, then you have to start with a 300 bushel stand. And so what you want to do is plant in as near ideal conditions as possible, even if that means delaying planting for a few days. Now, I don't mind sharing the story because Henderson Farms and Chad Henderson has shared this at our corn production meeting. And a few years ago, he planted in slightly wet conditions, and he had a lot of sidewall compaction. He said he could see where he planted, and we had that sidewall compaction year long. Now, sidewall compaction, that's a yield limiting issue, and so if possible, we want to try to plant when the conditions are ideal. Another thing is your planter speed. You want to keep your planter speed between 4 and 4.5 miles per hour. You want uniform emergence, and hopefully the majority of your seed will emerge within 12 to 24 hours. Question I get asked is, what about starter fertilizer? I have 2 questions to ask a farmer. What is his yield potential? Because the higher yield potential you have, the more likely you'll benefit from starter fertilizer. And then also, you need to adjust your nutrients for your starter fertilizer. Whatever your total of N and P is, and you put out with starter, you need to subtract this from your total nitrogen and phosphorus program. And traditionally, research has shown a 10 to 12 bushel yield increase with starter fertilizer, but that's going to be higher on sandy soils, or if you're striving for a higher yielding corn, 250 bushels plus. Now here's some research that I had in 2016 at the Sand Mountain Research Station. Now this wasn't the most ideal way to put out starter fertilizer. I like to have a 2x2 placement, but this was dribbled 2 inches from the row. And you can see that every starter program that I had out yielded where I didn't have starter fertilizer by at least 10 bushels. So this was the norm as far as starter fertilizer. I think when you start seeing higher yields, I would consider using 10 gallons of 28005 plus 10 gallons of 10340 or a pretty close to those combinations, plus miners. Some of the most important miners: zinc, magnesium, boron, and which is a secondary nutrient, sulfur. Those are all important nutrients for that plant when it runs out of the reserves that the seed has, to have close by so you get a good stand. And one thing we've seen is that for your higher yielding farmers, those are making 250 to 270 plus, they might want to look at putting your miners or your starter fertilizer on both sides of the row. In other words, dividing that 20 gallons of combination of 28005 or some formulation close to that, and 10340, and putting, if it's 10 gallons 20 or 10 gallons total, you might want to put 10 gallons on 2x2 on one side and 10 gallons on a 2x2 on the other side. This is really for your growers that are really striving for those ultra high yields of, I would say, 275 plus. Nitrogen. How much nitrogen should I apply? Well, that would depend on what your yield goal. For every bushel that you're striving to make, then you would look at putting 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So if you're shooting for a 200 bushel yield, 240 bushels of nitrogen is what I would strive to apply. Now, one thing I will say is that most of our high-end corn growers are much more efficient than 1.2 pounds of nitrogen. Most of them are 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel or a little bit less. And several factors could play in that, and one is getting back this organic material. The higher your organic material in your soil, the more nitrogen that's going to be released. The other thing I would do is use split applications. Remember, nitrogen is highly leachable, and I would fertigate if possible. And the last application of nitrogen should be at tassel or just prior to tassel. For high yield growers, I would recommend taking tissue samples every week. This will give you an idea of what nutrients you may be short on. If it doesn't help you this year, then it will definitely help you in years to come. I'd pay close attention to sulfur and magnesium. Now this is a slide of sulfur deficiency, but I will say that sulfur and magnesium deficiency are very similar, so it's hard to tell the difference between the two without a tissue test. Now, I work with both Nick McMeekin and Henderson Farms, and they took weekly tissue samples, and both of these are high yield growers. One field averaged 296, the complete field, over the irrigation and the dryland portion, the dryland corners. So this means that his irrigated was well over 300 pounds, and then on Nick McMeekin's, his was 285. Both of these showed either a shortage of sulfur with the tissue samples or an imbalance between the nitrogen and sulfur ratio. And also, we were seeing deficiencies in magnesium. Now, I'm going to be doing some research trials on this year to see if additional sulfur and magnesium will improve our yields. When you're looking at the nitrogen to sulfur ratio for optimal yields, you want to have a ratio of 10 to 1 to 15 to 1. And what we're seeing this year is 18 to 20 to 1. So I think that imbalance may have contribute to our sulfur deficiency. And I'd recommend for high yielding corn applying sulfur with each side dress application or fertigation of nitrogen. Irrigation is important, and what I would look at is the stage that my corn is and what the water use requirement is, and I would try to meet that. So this chart will be very helpful when you're irrigating. The other thing I want to talk about is weed control. One of the biggest problems that we have is morning glories, and usually our herbicides will break down towards the end of the year and we'll have morning glory problems even in our highest yielding fields. Now, what you want to do is with your herbicides is make timely applications according to the label, and I would use the growth stage rather than days. And then when weeds are small, that's the best time to control. Another thing to realize is atrazine is the backbone of a good weed control program for morning glory. It's the best herbicide we have for morning glory, and it also offers a different mode of action for controlling pigweed, which is important to help prevent palmer amaranth resistance in the future to some of our herbicides. One thing I like to tell farmers is the maximum use rate for atrazine, the 4L, is 2.5 quarts. What I like to do is put a quart up at planting and then come back roughly around 30 days when you're making that first Roundup or Ignite application, and I like to come back with 1.5 quarts of atrazine then. Another important thing is disease control. Two of our most common diseases that we have to fight are southern corn rust and northern leaf blight. One thing I'll say about fungicides, they are insurance. A lot of times we're putting them out there when disease is not present to protect against the disease, and this is the ideal situation. Now, if you tell me what the weather's going to be before the year starts or before we put out the fungicide application, if you can tell me what the weather's going to be for the next month, then I can tell you whether a fungicide is probably going to be profitable or not. Now, this year we probably didn't get the benefits from fungicides because we had a very dry year, but remember, they're insurance. It doesn't guarantee you every year that you're going to get a yield response from a fungicide. Usually fungicides are put out around tassel unless when your scouting disease is present earlier. Now, triazole fungicides are cheap and effective against southern corn rust, but they lack the broader activity against other diseases, including northern corn leaf blight, and they have about a 2-week protective window. One of the advantages they have over the strobilans is they have some curative activity if disease is present. Now, the strobilan fungicides are a combination of a strobilan triazole fungicide, has a 3-week protective window in a broader spectrum of disease control. Now, we have some new modes of actions of fungicides, say Preaxil, which is a strobilan plus a SDHI mixture, and they offer about the same protection as a strobilan and a triazole fungicide. Another thing I like to tell is boron is very important in pollination. So when you're putting out this fungicide application, I would consider putting out 1/4 pound of actual boron, and that equates to a quart of a 10% liquid boron or 1.5 pounds of a dry product such as Solubor. One thing I want to warn is do not mix any adjuvants with this fungicide application. Abnormal corn ear development called arrested ear syndrome can be caused by applying adjuvants, especially non-ionic surfactants, prior to or at tasseling. And this is a field that actually this is from South Georgia. When I was working in South Georgia, this is what most of the field looked like instead of a healthy ear, and this was due to the the aerial applicator, putting in a 9-surfactant with the fungicide application. So you don't want to put any adjuvants whatsoever in your fungicide application. Another important thing is to scout weekly. The best thing you can have in your cornfield is your shadow, and that's looking and evaluating the health of your corn crop. And the other thing is to scout for weeds, disease, and insects. This is, even though we had very low insect pressure on our corn last year, especially from stink bugs, this is early stink bug damage, that buggy whipping that you get. And then later in the year, we had a trial where we had to hand pick the corn in a replicated trial. And what I did know, even with the low stink bug pressure that we had throughout most crops, I started to see a lot of stink bug injury to the kernels. So I'm very concerned about stink bugs. Not only do they reduce yields, but they also allow the opportunity for secondary fungi and aflatoxin to get into that grain. And my final advice would be is get your combine in proper working order before you harvest. Harvest as soon as possible. This may be some higher moisture corn in the 20% or more, and you may mean dried, but it's better than letting your corn dry down and picking it up off the ground, risking it to poor weather. The one thing I would say is the less stress that you have on the plant, the higher your yield potential. So you want to eliminate all stress as possible, and that's compaction, lack of nutrients, water. And then also, what you want to do is watch your costs, because we're not only trying to make high yields, we're trying to make the most profit we can per acre. Now, I'm testing a lot of products that we have out, foliar fertilizer, seed treatments. I want to see if these are actually giving us the chance to make additional profit, or if they are reducing our profit. And then the other thing that we don't talk about much in production meetings is you need to establish a marketing strategy. Too often we concentrate on reducing the inputs to our crop. We concentrate on making higher yield, but we don't concentrate enough on getting more for our crop. And finally, I send out email updates on the crop, and if you like to get one of these email updates, you can email me at dem0029@auburn.edu, or you can call me anytime on my cell phone. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you make high yields and get a good price for your corn next year. How was that on time?